The electric Mercedes whispered up the drive as if it were apologizing for arriving at all. David Thompson killed the engine and sat for a moment in the hush, the mansion around him a familiar geometry of marble and shadow. He had canceled a board call on a whim, a Tuesday that had unspooled too much like every other. The weather report called for fog, which meant fewer helicopters, which meant the house should be empty. He thought of Ruth, of dinner with her, maybe a grilled salmon if she was up to it, and reached for his briefcase. He did not expect what he was about to hear. From the kitchen, Isabella's voice floated through the corridor, cool, practiced, the kind that had learned to make contempt sound like concern. "No, she can't keep coming to your events looking like that," she said. "It's embarrassing for all of us. We must do something before Malibu Week." There was a sound at the edge of the voice, a small, measured laugh that had the sharpness of a blade hidden in a ribbon. Ruth answered once, softly. "I only wanted to help with the linens, Isabella," she said. Her voice was steady, older, careful. It bore no plea, only the weight of a life folded into service. David's hand went still on the leather handle of his briefcase. The hallway light pressed his shadow against the plaster. He moved toward the sound because he could not move. The mansion's familiar layout folded him through the atrium and down the long hall toward the kitchen. A maid, one of the new young hires, passed him with a tray and did not meet his eyes. He saw a uniform draped over a chair like a patient garment, white apron over a gray dress, a name tag that read Ruth in neat block letters, and a pair of worn house slippers left near the hearth. He heard Isabella again, closer, the words now like stones. "People look, they whisper. You shouldn't let her. She's not—" She stopped, recalibrated, finished the sentence like a surgeon closing a wound. "Not presentable." David's breath was small and precise. He wanted to force open the kitchen door, to strike into the scene with all the power he owned. For a second, he imagined the headlines, his name, his wealth. But an older, quieter memory overrode the outrage. A small, dry hospital room in Miami, where a woman with thin hair and calloused hands had sat up one night to teach a 7-year-old him how to tie his shoes, because his mother worked the night shift. He remembered the smell of strong coffee and lemon soap, Mrs. Williams, Ruth, slipping $1 into his hand so he could buy a comic book. He remembered her making him promise to study, not because she feared failure, but because she knew what a promise could become. He opened the door. Isabella turned at his shadow, as if surprised to be caught in a private rehearsal. She straightened her back the way social women do when someone respected arrives, the posture of a public self. Ruth stood at the counter, hands folded around a chipped mug. The sight of her uniform, and the small, unwound dignity in the way she balanced the cup was worse than the words. "David," Isabella said, the syllable like a recalibrated chord. "You're early." He held the briefcase at his side and did the small math of the moment, the way a chief executive assessed risk. Isabella's smile was mechanically warm. Ruth's face was an unreadable map. The maid who had brought the tray moved to the fridge, eyes on the floor. The kitchen light bounced off marble and silver and a silver tray that looked embarrassingly like evidence. He didn't shout. He didn't storm. He set the briefcase down with a sound that was louder than he intended, and then walked through the scene with the economy of someone who knew fury could be a poor counselor. "Isabella," he said softly, and the room leaned in. Her face, which had been sculpted for public sympathy, hardened in a breath. "We were just talking about presentation," she said. "You know how things are with the guests." David looked at Ruth. Her eyes were steady. "Ruth, you okay?" he asked, and the question was both simple and enormous. She smiled, the kind of small smile that has weathered storms. "Always, David," she said. "I'll go freshen up." Isabella stepped forward with the practiced closeness of a woman who had learned to manage intimacy like a pageant. "Really, David, we should talk about boundaries, for the good of our household, the family." He listened to Isabella speak, and under her smooth sentences heard the texture of a plan. It was not a plan about comfort or health or even etiquette. It slid to one side like a gutter. Who should be visible and who should be hidden? Who could be paraded for sympathy and who was a liability? At the edge of the kitchen, the thermostat glowed a pale blue, a note of cold that seemed to echo. Ruth, who had been the architect of his childhood tuckings and small mercies, had been moved into the basement months ago, he learned later, on the thin pretext of privacy. The basement was tidy and small and cold. His people had installed a heater, which he had always meant to check. The sight of Ruth in a uniform made it clear that this had not been some mismanaged stroke of housekeeping. It had been a decision curated and executed by social calculus. David thought of the last time he had thanked her properly, an engraved watch at his 31st birthday that she refused to keep, and felt a debt born of omission. He felt, too, the very particular click of resolution. Wealth without guardianship was an empty account. Before he spoke again, he let the silence do its work. Isabella smoothed her gloves. Ruth set her mug down and, almost without drama, walked to the pantry to put away the coffee. She moved like someone who had practiced grace as an armor. David watched her, the way one watches a coastline after a storm, cataloging, taking bearings. In the living room later that night, the house hummed with its private appliances. Outside, the fog had thickened, muffling the world. David sat at his desk with the briefcase open but unopened and thought in the sequence of a man who made decisions for a living. He did not need to confront Isabella in a way that would play into her strengths, public performance and victimization. He needed facts, a chain, a ledger of wrongs that could be read by others with the same moral clarity he felt. Evidence, he knew, moved conversations that anger alone could not. He started with what the house offered. The security system logged everything. The cameras at the back door had timestamps. The kitchen camera was older but faithful. David did what he had always done in a crisis. He made the problem legible. He summoned the feed to the big screen in his home office. The footage was ordinary in its banality. A Wednesday afternoon, the date stamped in the corner like a shrug. Guests came and went on different days. The house-sitters were used to the choreography of luxury. But in the grainy blue of the kitchen camera, Ruth moved like a ghost through the frame, fetching linens, setting platters. The timestamps were a small catalog. Wednesday, 3:15 p.m., Friday, 10:02 a.m., Sunday, 6:34 p.m. In clip after clip she appeared in the same gray dress, the same white apron, the same name tag. Once, behind her back, a woman, Isabella's voice off camera, laughed with a hand over her mouth. Another time, a cake was carried from the guest room into the trash, a smear of frosting left like a wound on the bin. David's jaw worked once, twice, then steadied. Footage alone would be interpretation. Pattern would turn it into cause. He marked timestamps with the clinical attention of a man who had once built a company from nothing. Where patterns exist, intent can be inferred. There were too many repetitions. There was the mail with a label changed. There was a medical note slipped under a door at a date when Ruth had been turned away from a family gathering. He thought of the dinner where Ruth had been introduced as the housekeeper to a table of people who knew her as the woman who had raised their friend. The dissonance had been unmistakable. A message pinged on his phone. It was James Walsh, his lawyer, offering to stop by tomorrow afternoon. David thumbed back a short reply and set James for a preemptive consult. Then he called Marcus Rivera. Marcus answered on the second ring. "You sounded like you needed me," he said. The voice of a former detective has the economy of someone who has seen too many tragedies make themselves into scripts. There was a grain of dry humor. He called it late good news, and David allowed himself a faint smile. I need you for something domestic and delicate, not public yet." Marcus's laugh was brief. "You mean the kind of domestic that's better handled with cameras and patience than with a SWAT team." David let himself be guided by that humor. He described what he had overheard and what he had seen. He did not embellish. He handed Marcus access to selective feeds and asked for an audit, patterns, any access logs, who had administrative privileges. Marcus listened and made the decision-starved man feel competent. "I'll come by," he said. "We'll go through everything, legally, no theatrics, solid chain of custody. If it needs to go public, we make it stick." David hung up with a plan in which patience felt like a weapon. That night he knocked on Ruth's basement door. He had not been in the space since his children were small. The room was smaller than he remembered. The heater hummed in the corner, a reluctant apology. Ruth met him in the doorway in a cardigan he didn't own. For someone who had given up ease for countless small labors, she moved through domestic spaces with the economy of someone who never wasted motion. "Are you comfortable?" he asked, which was both literal and not. She closed the door behind him. There was a softness around her eyes he had never given himself permission to fully see. "It is fine, David," she said. "You take care of the larger things. I have always kept a smaller corner." "You should not be here without my knowledge," he told her. It sounded more like a fact than outrage. He needed her to be there as witness, not as a subject of pity. She regarded him a beat, and then, with that same small smile, said, "I am here and I am well. You do what you do. I will do what I can." He felt a swell of guilty affection. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you are busy," she said simply. "Because I did not want you worrying over small things. Because you have given me things that are not measured by time." Her voice was plain in a way that made it more indignant than anger, as if the offense had been a slow erosion rather than a single blow. There were things she would not say. Her silence spoke of slights, of invitations rescinded, of medical notes rewritten to favor convenience, of a social order that valued reputation over real tenderness. He felt the scale of his negligence. He had been loyal to a brand, a company, and the brand had not known to guard the human beings who had made him who he was. He kissed her hand in the private of the basement, a gesture empty of ceremony and full of apology. He promised nothing he did not intend to keep. He promised instead that he would see. The next days assembled like a plan moving from foam to steel. Marcus came 3 times in a week, with notebooks, lenses, the measured absence of a man who had been paid to keep calm. He pulled logs from the security firm, administrative accounts, entries, who had called for maintenance and when. He documented the timestamps, captured the frames. He did not cross lines. He did not invent evidence. He collected what the world had already recorded and gave it a spine. David also sifted through messages. He said the words in careful order because he knew that language matters in court and in the court of public opinion. David listened and asked the questions of a man whose life had been about controlling risk. His wealth had always felt to him like an instrument. He had failed, until now, to use it to defend the small human architectures closest to him. He thought of Ruth's teaching him to be upright, of her placing a hand on his head like benediction. The ledger of his indebtedness reasserted itself as a moral duty. Between them they arranged a simple, stark project: document, corroborate, compile. The gallery of proof had to be airtight, not for vengeance, but for accountability. Marcus found a sequence of video clips, Ruth arriving in a particular dress, escorted down to the basement by an unfamiliar young woman, housekeeping she had called herself, while Isabella swept past in new heels. He found a clip where Ruth's mail was replaced, where a medical appointment scheduled in Ruth's name was altered to a later date, effectively keeping her from a family lunch. He did not share raw footage more than necessary.
He took notes in Marcus's steady hand. The tenor shifted as evidence mounted. Isabella, in the outer world, remained luminous. She accepted invitations with a smile and curated her profile as if public opinion were a gold leaf. In private, her messages sharpened. In a thread David had not known he could access, she wrote, "We can't have anyone making us look bad. If she has to be out of sight, it's better for everyone." A second line followed with a clipped instruction, "I'll deal with the paperwork." That word, paperwork, hung like a lead weight. What paperwork? Guardianship? Medical directives? The insinuation was that unpleasant formalities could be manufactured. David felt a hot edge behind his eyes. He forced himself to be calm. The path to justice is not paved by impulse. For the first time in years, he let the idea of public exposure enter his planning. There was, he realized with the cold logic of a strategist, an occasion when Isabella would be most vulnerable, their philanthropic gala at the Getty. Each year, socialites arrived in layers of satin and applause. This year, Isabella was to be honored for a newly minted Women in Philanthropy award. The event would draw the local press and a smattering of national attention. It would be the perfect place to collapse illusion into accountability. But even as the idea floated, charity events are traps for reputations. The rational part of him warned, exposure without preparation can backfire. In desperation, a socialite can manufacture a scene and recast herself as victim. David had seen it before. He had been the architect of apologies in boardrooms, had learned how narratives could be co-opted. He needed a strategy that would leave no room for a second narrative to replace the truth.
In the days that followed, they built what Marcus called a dossier. Clips with timestamps, message threads printed and annotated, witness statements on letterhead, logs of who had maintenance access when and who ordered the moved files. They took care to preserve provenance, to show that these were not stories told by angry parties, but records produced by devices that had simply been doing their job. James drafted the language that could be used to compel attention without premature legal exposure. David wanted the story to be read by more than friends. He wanted the public to see what one man's household could permit. There were dangers. Isabella was a performer, and in performance she could be persuasive. The last thing he wanted was for Ruth to be dragged into the light in a way that made her a spectacle. Ruth's dignity had to be preserved at every step. They agreed. Ruth would be consulted about how she wanted to move forward. Her voice must not be usurped. When he told Ruth about the dossier, she took it with the characteristic stillness of someone who had been asked to choose between two forms of courage. "If people see this," she said, "they may not understand what it means to be made small by good manners." "You'll have control," David said. "You'll tell them what you want them to know." She considered the offer like someone studying a map. "I don't want revenge, David," she said. "I want acknowledgement, and I want to teach other children not to be ashamed of who cares for them." The words settled between them like a new covenant. He promised that the next time he arranged a dinner, it would be with her dignity as the centerpiece, not an afterthought. They rehearsed. They mapped the routes of exposure. They spoke to one journalist contact, a steady, reputable reporter with local influence, without tipping the plan into a leak. David did not want tabloids or sensationalists to be the first voice. He wanted a voice that would translate the facts into a moral ledger. The choice to go to a serious outlet was strategic. It would frame the narrative in terms of accountability and systemic behavior rather than gossip. Isabella continued to move through the world as if nothing had shifted. She posted photos of charity lunches and smiled for lenses as if the public stage were her natural habitat. Privately, her messages grew clipped. David intercepted one by routine access to a shared calendar that contained a phrase that tightened his jaw. "We need to ensure no one undermines the evening." It was the sentence of someone who feared loss of control, and control for her had always been a currency. On a Friday morning 2 weeks after he had first walked into the kitchen, David convened a small group at the house. Marcus arrived with his legal pad. James parked 2 steps behind him, carrying a slim folder. Ruth came down from her basement with a knitted sweater around her shoulders.
The 3 of them sat around the dining table while David projected the dossier onto the screen as if giving a quarterly presentation. He began not with fury but with facts. He showed the timestamps. He pointed to the messages. He read a single sentence from a thread aloud, an unemotional voice for an emotional story, and let the words land. Isabella had written about cleaning up appearances and about getting rid of complications. The phrase, once read aloud, had a voice that was smaller than the reality. It was administrative cruelty. Ruth listened and nodded in ways that made grief visible but not performative. She did not sob or collapse. She folded her hands as if settling into work. It was that quality of steadiness that had always carried him through waves of uncertainty. She insisted on clarity. "Make sure everything is factual," she said. "No embellishment." David's throat tightened. "We will not lie," he said. "We will not sensationalize. We will be precise." Marcus added, "People respond to clarity. If we show the pattern, it will speak." He had the pragmatism of someone who had seen that cumulative truth often becomes undeniable. They planned the sequence of release like a campaign that had nothing to do with marketing and everything to do with moral architecture. The gallery would be shown at the gala, recorded segments on the big screen accompanied by a live statement. Simultaneously, they would alert a small group of journalists so that the narrative would not be splintered by rumor. James suggested language for legal claims and steps to freeze any paperwork that might be filed in haste. He spoke carefully about conservatorship and fiduciary responsibility without promising outcomes. At the end of the meeting, David walked Ruth back to the basement door. He noticed small things, how she smoothed the hem of her cardigan, how she tucked stray hairs behind her ear. "Do you want me to be there at the gala?" he asked. Ruth's face was a map of deciduous emotion. "If you think it will help, if it will keep the truth straight for others." He kissed her forehead. "Then we will do it together." They had, for now, everything a good plan needs: evidence, corroboration, and an altar of public ritual where truth could be made visible. But there was a thinness to the certainty. The social world is a complicated place where reputations can be engineered and emergent sympathies can derail the most meticulous exposures. There was also the quieter peril of underestimating the reach of the woman they were about to confront. Isabella's social cell was rich and practiced in damage control. She had friends who met each other at galleries and who knew how to spin narratives into absolution. Over the following days, he watched Isabella prepare for the gala, in public and in private. She wore a gown that made the press smile. She exuded a softness that had been rehearsed in the mirror 1,000 times.
On the night before the event, she hosted a small pre-party for her circle, invites meant to consolidate loyalty. Patrons arrived with white gloves and toasts. Someone brought a bottle of champagne that had been saved for the right face. When Isabella laughed, it was like a glass chime. Yet, in a private message intercepted on a shared calendar, she wrote, "Keep the guest list tight. No surprises. If David's people push, deflect." David felt the old colonial eeriness of wealth, how proximity confers power, and how social rituals can be scaffolded to obscure cruelty. He also felt, with a rare clarity, the duty of calling out harm where it occurs. On the morning of the gala, as a fog bank rolled over the ocean, he sat in his home office and reviewed the compiled package. The folder had been assembled with care. Each piece of evidence had been cross-referenced with times and corroboration. Marcus had prepared witness statements. James had prepared the legal send notes should the plan be derailed. There was a comfort in the precision of it, the way order tends to relieve outrage of its worst impulses. He thought of one line Ruth had said that had lodged in his head like a pebble in a shoe: teach other children not to be ashamed. He wanted to ensure that when the story unrolled, the message would not be revenge, but restoration. David stood by the window and watched servants set up for the evening. He thought of the photograph of Ruth he would allow to be shown, not one that played to pity, but one that showed a woman with the quiet dignity of someone who had worked hard and loved harder. He imagined the effect of that image juxtaposed against screenshots of a chat, a cake in a trash can, a name tag pinned beneath a dress. He felt, at the center of all his wealth and habit, the small, clarifying flame of what he had to protect. He heard a door close downstairs and a soft murmur of voices in the foyer. Guests would begin to arrive in a few hours. Isabella would want to enter like any queen accustomed to crowns. He had never enjoyed confrontation, but he had also never failed to answer when he heard injustice near his own blood. He called Marcus one last time before the night. "If anything goes sideways, don't engage publicly," he said. "We keep the narrative factual and we let the truth carry it." Marcus's voice was brief. "Understood." When he hung up, a message arrived from an unknown number with a photo attached. Ruth, standing beside a recycling bin, a paper napkin stuck beneath her slipper. The caption read, "Not for gala." David's hands closed into fists and then uncurled. He placed the phone on the table and began to rehearse what he would say, sober, precise, without spectacle. Power can be a blunt instrument. It can also be a balm if applied with intention. Outside, the fog thinned for a moment and the ocean showed itself like a distant coin. The house took a breath and prepared for the performance of the night.
Inside, under chandeliers and behind laughter, a private ledger of humiliation waited to be turned into a public record. As the sun lowered, guests began to arrive, champagne decanters and dress rehearsals, friends who had all the best stories in common. Isabella glided among them, a practiced magnet for praise. David walked into the ballroom with the weight of the folder under his arm, a man who had decided he would not be a bystander anymore. He had all the elements in place, but he also held, like a coiled reserve, the knowledge that the moment of exposure was not a single act, but a carefully timed symphony. The first movement was about to begin. The chandeliers trembled with polite applause as Isabella moved through the room, every head a small lighthouse turned toward her. Perfume and soft laughter filled the air. Waiters in black tails threaded between guests with trays of oysters and tiny spoons of caviar. David stood just inside the door, the folder heavy at his side, like a quiet promise. He watched her smile, as if he were watching a practiced painting be hung, beautiful from a distance, varnished too well to show the brushstrokes. He gave the signal they had rehearsed, a slight lift of his chin toward the stage, a nod to Marcus, who stood near the media desk, to the lighting technician who had been briefed to respond to a cue. Marcus's jaw was a cliff of calm. James sat 2 rows back, face composed, hands folded. There were a few people from Isabella's circle, Jennifer Walsh in a silk gown, Patricia Sterling arranging her lips into a compassionate expression, whose eyes flicked in his direction and then away. For weeks David had thought about this entrance down to the smallest detail, timing, cadence, the exact moment when everything would be made legible. If you want to see how he confronts betrayal, subscribe. It will only take a second. He had not wanted spectacle for its own sake. What he wanted was an unambiguous ledger, a way to show in plain terms what had been done and by whom. The ballroom darkened around the edges as music faded, and the host took the stage to introduce the evening. Isabella, luminous, accepted a gilded program and posed for photographs with the ease of someone born to applause. Then the lights shifted.
The big screen at the back of the stage glowed, a simple slate of black, and the first frame, a single photograph of Ruth in a plain sweater, appeared. The audience hummed, polite and curious. The photograph was not chosen for pity. It showed her, mid-laugh, a natural face, hair tucked behind one ear. It was the kind of image that asks you to recognize a person rather than a role. A clip followed, a grainy kitchen camera, time-stamped, showing Ruth moving quietly across the frame with an apron around her waist. The camera angle was unflattering by accident, not malice, just the way a house records the comings and goings of a life.
She did not dwell on pain. She spoke of learning to code in evening classes at the community college, of the children she wanted to teach to trust themselves, of the debt a life of love exacts in quiet ways. When the footage ended and the messages were visible on the screen, there was a slow, almost mechanical ripple of reactions, phones lifted to record, whispers accumulating like a low wind. A few guests turned away as if to shield themselves from the awkwardness of belonging to a room where such things could be true. Jennifer Walsh, her smile gone thin, fumbled with a napkin and then set it down, gaze fixed on the stage. Patricia Sterling's expression collapsed into an attempt at sympathy that lacked conviction. Isabella reached for the microphone with an edge in her voice that she had not intended. "This is an invasion of private life," she said. "You take messages out of context and—" David listened with the quiet of someone who had long since learned the art of letting facts finish sentences. Marcus, near the back, stood visible enough that cameras could pick him out, an embassy of forensic calm. James kept his face neutral, a legal fulcrum ready to move. Isabella's next move was immediate. She turned quickly toward a nearby aide and made a terse phone call. Her lawyer's name appeared on someone's feed almost at once. The attorney took the camera and stepped forward with an offer to review the materials privately, to ask for a pause in public judgment. It might have been a strategy to reclaim the narrative, but when the attorney, upon viewing the dossier, retreated into a 3-sentence statement about advising cool heads and seeking private counsel, something close to the rupture of trust had already occurred. The change was not cinematic in the way tabloids make it. There was no instant villainization. There was instead a social closing of curtains. Invitations that had once been automatic felt in the tender hours after the reveal suddenly conditional. The phone calls that sustained a social life dried up, not with shouts, but with polite scheduling conflicts and a new reserve that had the force of ostracism. Outside the ballroom, David fielded calls. A trusted reporter confirmed that the documents had been received and that coverage would begin in the morning. A legal phone line confirmed the steps James had initiated: immediate revocation of informal access to household accounts, filing notices to preserve certain documents, and a request for a conservatorship review if there were any contested claims about Ruth's capacity. All of it was procedural, none of it deterministic. James had insisted upon language that spoke to process rather than destiny. Inside, Isabella's composure frayed. The practiced cadence of her defense, private matters, nuance, misinterpretation, began losing purchase as friends in the room quietly checked their phones and saw threads they could not unsee. A message from one of them, short and taut, said simply, "I can't be part of this." Those were the notes that hollowed a social life more effectively than any formal sanction. The night did not burst with retribution, it unspooled instead into consequence. Some guests left quietly, others lingered and asked questions, searching for clarity. Cameras still shone, the press corps took notes in a manner that had lost its earlier deference. Isabella, who had never learned to hold a room when a ledger of facts was laid at her feet, retreated toward the inner circle she trusted and found it narrowed. After the gala, the public record grew. Local outlets ran balanced pieces documenting what had been shown, quoting Ruth and describing the chain of evidence without sensationalism.
Social feeds filled with phrases like systemic disregard and accountability, and while the language of justice spread, so did the complexities. Legal fights would come, claims would be made, and the truth could be litigated in courts and comment sections alike. Marcus and James had anticipated the complexity. They had structured the release to invite scrutiny rather than to preempt it. In the days that followed, Isabella's world felt smaller. Her invitations thinned. Corporate sponsors she had once counted on paused contracts pending review. The philanthropy boards she sat on circulated statements expressing concern and offering to conduct an independent assessment. It was not theatrical, but it was real. The scaffolding that held her public identity was being disassembled by a series of small, unglamorous choices. She did not vanish into cartoonish villainy. There were moments when she sought explanation with furrowed, raw vulnerability, a call to David in which she pleaded for commiseration, an attempt to gather mutual friends as witnesses to her good intentions. But her apologies often read as fragments, too tailored and too late. Isolated, she made a statement that read as both remorse and self-defense. People recognized the language of reputation management and found it wanting. Legal avenues opened slowly and carefully. James filed motions to ensure Ruth's autonomy and to remove any unilateral control over her finances. He worked to secure records and formalize Ruth's rights in the household, things that should have been settled without public pressure but had been left informal for too long. David did not seek to weaponize his position for humiliation. He sought to close the avenues through which private cruelty had been practiced under a veneer of civility. Investigations were suggested and in some quarters quietly begun. Inquiries into guardianship paperwork, audits into household accounts, questions about who had access to what. Authorities were contacted. Journalists noted that inquiries were underway. None of it promised a single outcome. That was not his aim.
What he wanted was to hold systems accountable in a way that treated his mother's dignity as evidence, not as an afterthought. Isabella struggled in rooms that used to be hers. Her allies felt the gravity of association. Some distanced themselves with gentle phrasing, others with blunt messages. Patricia Sterling called and left a voicemail, the tone courteous but withdrawn. Jennifer avoided the phone. These were not theatrical rejections, they were reputational calcification, people deciding not to be seen near what might tarnish them. It is a slow thing, social exile, but it is thorough. Ruth, for her part, moved through the aftermath with the same deliberate steadiness she'd shown at the podium. She agreed to speak with a few outlets, but always on her terms and always with a larger purpose. She wanted the focus to be on the systems that let such humiliations pass for domestic solutions, and on the small interventions that might prevent other elder caretakers from being rendered invisible. She chose to speak not as a victim seeking retribution, but as a woman asking a community to reconsider what it valued. In the months that followed the gala, the house changed its rhythms. Certain access codes were revoked, household directories were rewritten, third-party trustees were appointed to oversee certain documents. David moved Ruth into a thoughtfully arranged suite on the main floor, close to the kitchen and the light. He insisted on ordinary things, tea at 3, a fresh paper on Sundays, that felt like repairs rather than gestures. He also honored Ruth's wish for purpose. With careful planning and in partnership with community leaders, he established a small learning center in her name, a modest space with second-hand laptops and a whiteboard, a place where children from the neighborhood could learn basic programming and digital literacy. Ruth taught there, not out of obligation, but because she found joy in the small, stubborn victories of education. She called the class Practical Magic, how to repurpose old machines, how to write clean code, how to debug a stubborn app and a stubborn life. The first day she stood before the kids, some of them wary, some eager, she moved with a confidence born of a life that had spent decades keeping others afloat. She had a simple rule. Everyone raised their hands, everyone spoke, everyone left with something they had made.
She taught patience and iteration with the same tenderness she had once taught him to tie his shoes. David, when he visited, watched from the back of the room as she demonstrated a simple loop until the children laughed at a small triumphant error. They climbed to success the way good gardens climb a fence, slow, green, persistent. The community noticed the center. Local parents began to leave their kids in the afternoons, grateful for a place that taught practical skills, but also courtesy and persistence.
Stories circulated, not of scandal, but of small recoveries. A teenager who landed an internship after building a website in Ruth's class. A shy boy who learned to speak his ideas aloud. The center did not erase what had happened, but it remade a fragment of the world in better proportions. Isabella's public life, once a constellation of galas and curated breakfasts, dimmed into private consultation rooms and apology letters that few read beyond the first paragraph. She sought help at times, attempted to rebuild bridges, and in quieter moments seemed to grapple with the contours of what she had enabled. Some observers suggested she might find a way back through contrition and work. Others doubted whether such restoration without reckoning is possible. The story did not resolve into a neat redemption. There was, instead, an unfolding of consequences and attempts at repair, as there is in most human stories. David spent less time in the center of public events. He visited Ruth often and sat in the back row of her classes, watching her move through content with a teacher's ease. He also re-examined his own life, how the scaffolding of power could shelter cruelty when left unattended. He instituted new policies in his household, transparent accounting, independent oversight, a culture of listening. He funded scholarships and supported elder care training programs. He knew that money alone cannot mend what habit and class can crack, but he also knew that resources used with clarity could make structural change possible. There were legal aftershocks. Papers were filed, responses were written, lawyers negotiated terms that would be hashed out in quieter rooms. The record reflected disputes and counterclaims, the sort of legal choreography that takes time to move into place. No single courtroom judgment was the story's moral center. The real work was in the daily, ordinary restitution, a woman being recognized by name, a community appointment, children learning skills that build agency. Months later, on a bright winter morning, David and Ruth walked the perimeter of the small center as kids ran by with laptops in backpacks. A mural had been painted on the outer wall, bright shapes and a line in bold letters that Ruth had suggested. Learn to make things, not just to consume them. A teacher waved, a parent called out thanks. David felt not triumph, but a steady warmth that comes from small, sustained repair. "Do you ever think of going back to Miami?" he asked her as they paused by the mural. She tilted her head as if considering the gravity of roots and the strange itineraries of life. "Home is where one can be useful," she said simply. "I have a few useful years left. I would rather spend them teaching than remembering." He smiled then, a small, private thing. "I learned a lot from you," he said. "Not how to be wealthy, but how to be bearable when the world is not kind." She reached out and touched his arm, a little pressure, both gentle and firm. "You taught me to trust you with the big things," she said. "Now you must teach others the same." He agreed, without vanity. In a world that often equates money with decision, he had found a different measure, the capacity to make restitution and then to sit with the consequences until they bent into something useful. The press cycle moved on, as it does, scavenging for fresh outrage. Isabella did what some people do, apologized, retreated, occasionally surfaced to announce private contrition. Some doors stayed closed to her, not as punishment, but as a reorganization of social preference. There were no simple moral gestures. There were small, sustained practices of accountability and service that continued to matter long after the headlines faded.
On a quiet evening, David sat with Ruth in a small office at the Learning Center, the hum of computers like a steady undercurrent. Children's voices rose in a chorus down the hall. He thought of the initial moment in the kitchen, the briefcase, the dropped hush, and how that single, unexpected return had begun a sequence that neither of them had planned. He thought about the limits of wealth and the obligations that come with proximity to power. Ruth looked at him, and in a tone that had the authority of someone who had kept a house and kept a heart for decades, said, "You did not have to make a spectacle. You made a path." He nodded. "I didn't want to be the man who noticed too late." She smiled the way she always had, smaller now, but with something like relief. "Then let us keep making paths," she said, "paths for others to walk without fear of being hidden." He promised, and this time his promise felt less like an intention and more like a plan. He would fund more centers, insist on oversight where privileges were misapplied, teach boards the language of dignity. He would use his resources not to dominate, but to protect the small things that sustain people: accurate records, real voices, access to help. The story settled into its quieter rhythms: Ruth's classes, a few lawsuits and countersuits handled by professionals, television segments that recounted the facts without heat, and a neighborhood that had a new place for curious kids. Isabella, who had once turned every gathering into a stage, learned, slowly and often painfully, how to inhabit rooms where her presence did not guarantee applause. Some attempts at repair were clumsy, some were sincere. The outcome was not a single moral decree, but a rearrangement of priorities. On the last day of that first year, the center held a small graduation, 13 kids with certificates stapled clumsily, faces bright with a modest pride. Ruth stood at the front, a ribbon in her hand, while David sat in the back with a few board members and teachers. She called each child forward, asked them what they had built, and offered a short, exact compliment. When she finished, David climbed the steps and took the microphone for a moment.